Hi, this is Jim Hennager. It's December 11th. This is Table Talks for the New Independent Party. Today I'd like to get into uh, the issues of mainstream media, mainstream knowledge, mass media, and those related areas. And I'd like to get into this because I think these are some underlying issues that relate to a lot of the problems that we're seeing with American politics and also what's happening around the world. And it has to do with the flow of information, maybe the free flow of information or lack of it. And what we're seeing is that information is coming to people very fast from a lot of different sources, and people aren't dealing with this information in what I would call a very rational or deep way. So when I talk to my students, I try to explain to them that when you're presented some information and you get it from different sources, and one source is telling you this and another source is telling you, completely the opposite, I feel like it's your responsibility to check it out, because both may not be true, and somebody's trying to either influence you or mislead you in some cases to have information that wide. And we're seeing issues like that every day. Right now, people from 140 countries are in Paris talking about global weather and the changes in weather, and you're seeing it every day in the news. This scientist says this and this scientist says exactly the opposite. So I think it's imperative that people come to some way of understanding that they can get to some conclusions on controversial issues where people don't necessarily agree, and there may be some history to why this is developing. So I need to lay the groundwork that particularly in social issues, economic issues, political issues, they're often very complex, complicated, and you need to realize that they have sides. I think of it like a Rubik's Cube. There's just so many different sides to an issue, and some of them can be very complicated. They also have levels. People at different levels of government, different levels of a corporation, different levels economically, out in society. As you look at things at different levels, you're going to have a different perspective, and those people at different levels may have different agendas. So where somebody at just a everyday person level may see something very troubling, maybe somebody at the top of an organization or government would see it completely different. And I think that can create a lot of perception problems. I also need to convey that social issues, economic issues, political issues, they all have tails. They have a history. And I think we often forget that there's a history to these issues. They didn't just appear last night or today. They've been around, most of them, for a long time. And if you don't understand where these issues are coming from and kind of put them in a historical perspective, you can miss an awful lot of what's actually going on. Maybe 20 years ago, there was a study done in Texas by a university in which they asked several thousand respondents if they knew much about the history of the early Christian church. And over 90% of them admitted they had no real knowledge of the early history of the church. But more troubling was 95 of those people indicated that it didn't matter to them. They felt really good about how they felt about their faith. They didn't need to know about that history. Well, that's troubling from a lot of different directions, because I think in many ways what we're having people do is they hear a soundbite in a political ad, or they see a headline in a newspaper or on TV, and maybe their friends have talked about it or their family have talked about it a little bit, and they come to a conclusion without really giving it a lot of thought or looking into it. And that leaves us with people at a very shallow level of understanding of issues. I can vouch for the fact that most of my students haven't gotten into most social issues very deep at all. They have never done any reading on them. Many of them have never heard about the issues. So when you have an electorate, people are going to vote for the next president, at that level, it can be very dangerous, mainly because they can be manipulated so easily. Okay, so let me give you a quick background on what information has meant to societies, and if you go back, say, 5,000 years ago to some of the early civilizations, there wasn't a lot of literature. There wasn't a lot of people that understood the written word. In fact, there were very few people that could read and write 5,000 years ago. If you weren't a high priest or a person of stature in a tribe or a kingdom, you probably were never given the opportunity to learn to read or write. So people, 5,000 years ago, simply went through life without knowing how to read or write. They didn't understand numbers, and they probably didn't travel very far from their homes. So information was very closed, and it could be controlled very easily by somebody, a ruler or a government official, and it usually wasn't challenged a lot. If you come 2,000 years ago, like 0 AD, you might find more people that could read and write, and you probably may have had 200,000 or 300,000 manuscripts at that time. This would have been 2,000 years ago. Just a safe guess that you might have had maybe 200,000 people that could read or write. There just weren't a lot of people still that were going to schools. There really weren't any schools there other than maybe some private kind of institutions, learning institutions, or scholarly kind of academic areas. And people didn't communicate by writing. They didn't have TVs or radios or computers then. So still, the amount of information that a person might have on a day-to-day basis is very limited. And it would have to be by word of mouth. And of course, there were people that traveled around and shared information, but it wasn't a common thing. If you came forward to 14th century, when the Gutenberg press was brought forward, now you started to get into the ability for people to copy or duplicate books, and you probably saw that the amount of manuscripts, the amount of books started to multiply very quickly after that. In the 14th, 15th century, you might have had several million manuscripts out there, and more people could read. If you came forward then to the late 1700s, particularly here in the United States, our own Benjamin Franklin was an editor and published newspapers and books. Thomas Paine certainly was an author at that time, and his book was very instrumental in influencing people to support the revolution. So the early writings were probably to inform people. They were government documents or record-keeping kind of diaries of sort. By the 17th, 18th centuries, we started to see writing for more people because more people were attending some type of school. The colonies made an effort to have schools, and they wanted people to know how to learn to read and write. And so as the base of people able to do that, then we saw more and more literature, we saw printing. And through the 1800s, almost every small town would eventually have a town editor, a town newspaper. So you began to share information much more freely, and we also started to see that you could have nonfiction. Nonfiction probably started in the Middle Ages, but by the 1800s, you started to see sort of dime novels and Western novels, very short kinds of short stories. And so you had fiction and nonfiction literature coming forward. You also had people writing to influence, to try to steer people into believing one thing or another. And by 1950s, you had a fourth genre, I would call it, of purpose for literature, and that was to sell something. Those people that were putting things out in newspapers and magazines and on the news had a direct interest in trying to sell something, make some money. And so you have different reasons why people write or publish things or even talk about it on the news. So you have to understand that there's those different reasons. And there was one very well-known secret organization in the 1800s here in the United States printed a pamphlet that basically said that the general population in the United States were like dumb cows or dumb sheep. They would believe anything that people put out, particularly if it came from the government. So you had people who were trying to deceive or misinform. At the same time, these other genres of literature were coming forward. So today, you find that we have all of those in full form, and it's sometimes easy to think that, well, it's on the internet or it's in the newspaper, or I read it in a magazine, it has to be true, but it doesn't have to be true at all. In fact, there are people who get paid to write articles, who get paid to come on these news kind of shows and basically lie. And so if you kind of understand that, you need to be always kind of on the defensive. You have to be skeptical. You have to kind of ask where that information is coming from, and is it proprietary, or is it benefiting somebody in a way to make money or to protect some bit of knowledge. So as it's developed that we have more and more people reading and more things to read, you develop a body of knowledge, a body of literature, and probably by the 1900s you begin to have a notion of mainstream media, mainstream knowledge. Now, even on a master's level, if you're writing a thesis, you'd be asked to try to cover or get to a level where you had 80% of the literature covered. So it's necessary to have a body of knowledge that you can work with. Now, what criteria you use to define your body of knowledge becomes important, because if you're at the funny book level or the comic book level, or you're at the level that you can read these magazines as you go out from the grocery store, those casual magazines don't have a lot of rigor. They don't have a lot of reliability to them. In fact, it's pretty well known that they just make stuff up. So if your body of literature is at that level, you're in trouble if you really want to get to the truth on things. And if you move up into more and more rigorous kinds of literature, to the point where you have magazines and newspapers at the next level, and they can be biased. Those people are in business. They sell advertisements. Those people that advertise and give them money often have requirements of what kind of articles are published and printed that favor them, and not give you all of the sides to issues. Excuse me. So you come above that and you get into more academic kinds of literature where people have researched it. They looked at a lot of different conflicting information, and they've come to some conclusion, up to maybe the highest point where you'd have literature that's peer-reviewed and looked at by a number of competent scholars. You might say that's the highest level of mainstream. But even then, and we'll probably get into a couple cases where that mainstream was so far off. They were just, completely wrong about criticizing somebody, getting somebody fired, and really causing a lot of problems because somebody was outside of that mainstream, and it conflicted with commercial interest of people that were wanting to keep something, from the public. So we do see that even today. It's getting easier and easier for a smaller and smaller group of companies, corporations, individuals to control that mainstream to their to their advantage. And some of that happens because we have a trend developing here, particularly in the United States, and I think it's around the world, where bigger companies are now buying up all of the competition, and instead of having hundreds of companies in an area, in many cases here in the United States, you're down to 5 or 6 main companies in any area you can think about: communications, transportation, mass media, pharmaceuticals, education. In any field, you're coming down to 5 or 6 main groups of people that control those companies. Then these groups have directors on their board of directors who cross. So you have people from this group having directors on another group, and that's called interlocking directories. And it's very prevalent. So it's not just that you have this group trying to influence the media or the mainstream. You have multiple groups who are interlocking till you get something called the Eastern Establishment, or the establishment, or they, in some cases, are becoming more and more defined in fewer and fewer people. So it's very possible that a small group of people can be influencing what's on the news at night, what's in the newspapers, what gets printed in magazines, popular magazines, and that becomes known as the mainstream information. You get mainstream science, you get mainstream textbooks, you get mainstream newspapers, and they just kind of support each other in certain kind of perspectives. We see that in the global warming issues because what has happened is a number of these special influences, special interest groups, have developed a narrative that they feel that they would like to push, and it involves people believing that it's human cause of pollution. The greenhouse effect is a human kind of result, and they have solutions that are economically beneficial to certain kinds of special interest. But in fact, there could be a lot of different reasons why we're having global warming, and we've probably had global warming repeat over and over again in history. So it's very important to remember that the mainstream is always changing. In my PhD dissertation, I looked at 100 years of literature. I looked at newspapers. I read every newspaper, looking at how editorial, how authors were predicting certain things, and then because I could see the advantage of hindsight, I could tell whether they were accurate or not in those predictions. And it turned out in the newspaper that I read, they were very poor at predicting the future. In fact, less than 15% of their predictions, were even close. I then looked at professional writers in the area of economic projections and government projections, urban planning, city planning, and only 18% of their projections ever came true. So it was still way off. I then was required actually to also look at some very well-known science fiction writers, uh, people like Heinlein and Arthur Clarke and Asimov. These people had one leg in the fiction world, but they had the other leg in academia, and they wrote both fiction and nonfiction for most of their life. Those people and what they were talking about, actually predicting, was closer to 75%. So it taught me a good lesson that you couldn't depend on the mainstream press, so to speak, to provide any kind of predictive value for the future, where people who had, allowed to be imaginative and creative, and also had some angle to what was actually happening in the future technology and scientific areas, they were very better. They were very much better at predicting the future. So what I'm envisioning is a big arrow, and that's the body of that arrow is the mainstream, and out here on the front of it is what we'd call cutting edge, maybe controversial information, not accepted as mainstream, but it's out here in front. And then you have the body of the mainstream, and then in the back you have old hat kind of stuff. Well, we threw that out 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 100 years ago. So you have a stream of information, and it's constantly moving in this direction. Now, not everything that's out here on the cutting edge becomes mainstream, but a lot of it does. And so if you're trying to, see into the future, it's very dangerous to just look at the mainstream. You really need to look at what information is being generated out here on the cutting edge. If you're looking at what technologies are coming, you want to look out there to see what kind of new ideas, new technology is developing out here on the cutting edge. Because in 20 years, almost everything is going to be moving in that way. Now, when you're in your present time and you're thinking about things, you don't feel that things are changing a lot, but they really are. If you just thought back 20 years ago, we didn't have personal computer, we didn't have the cell phones, we didn't have emails. It was a dramatically different world. And if you go back 50, 60 years, it was again, that much more different. So we are right in the middle of a lot of things changing. And people need to understand that isn't just going to stop. It's going to continue into the future. So the future is going to be different than today. I can almost guarantee that to you. Things change, everything changes, and you're going to change. The information is going to change. So just because they say it's mainstream, and if you think out, on the outside, you're goofy, or you're, conspiracy person, or some kind of weirdo out there, I've always taken heart by that that was a compliment, because I could see that the mainstream is moving in my direction. And in my case, I could see that in 20-year time spans, I've gone through now 2 or 3 of those since I wrote my dissertation, you can predict a direction that things are moving. And I think that's important to remember, that things change because there's an opportunity to move in a new direction, or there's something pushing it from behind, some kind of conflict, some kind of turmoil. And you can get to a point where you can kind of see what's coming into the future, but you can't necessarily predict it. So I'm not a prophet, or anybody like that. But in looking at the problems of today, and looking at what the mainstream press is all about today, you can see that things have to change. We can't continue to keep these kind of problems, the social economic problems that we have today. If we don't resolve them, they're going to get worse in the future, not better. They're not just going to go away. And so you're multiplying people, and we're now at 7 billion. In 40 years, we could be at 10 billion people. So you can just see that the number of people are multiplying, the number of people getting to information is multiplying, and the people trying to control that information are doing everything they can to control it. So a lot of what's out there today is misleading, is deliberately falsified, and it has a reason for that. So I'm hoping that you're picking up that you need to be kind of skeptical about information today. Even, you can check me out on what I'm saying, but if we don't change how we do economics, how we do politics, how we do society, those problems are going to go forward, and we're going to have a radically different future than we have today. I can just sit here and tell you that if we continue the way we are, we're going to have not a democracy in the future, but we're going to have a very strong oligarchy, maybe even some kind of dictator, fascist kind of government. That I can see that coming, and I can see that economically we're not going to be laissez-faire kind of free capitalism. We're going to have a very controlled, prohibitive kind of economy, where most of the people are at the bottom and they have a very few rich people at the top. You don't have to be a genius to see that that's coming. Plus, you have to understand that there are certain ways that they try to influence the media today, that mainstream, and some of their techniques, involve, I think what's happening in the global warming, you come out and say, well, we've analyzed 100 different studies and 99 or 98% of them all say, a certain conclusion. Well, all you have to do is pay the 99 to 100 people that are doing those surveys to come out, or studies to come out a certain way, and you can make that statement. You completely ignore all those studies, all that research that disagrees with it. You see that in pharmaceutical companies when they bring a new drug forward to get okayed by the FDA. They're presenting only case studies of successful kinds of test trials. They don't want to have anybody know that they're trials that didn't come out successful. So you can bias it very easily by the number of trials and surveys and slant it to the direction that you want. You're seeing a lot of surveys, polls taken all the time now, and the polls change all the time. But you can influence the result of those polls by just how you ask a question or who you pick out to ask. So you have to be very careful that you don't become dependent on that kind of information unless you can see where the information's come from, how it was developed, and how rigorous they were in putting it together. And that's difficult. I mean, most of us don't have enough time to check out everything that we see or hear on the TV or read on the internet. But you have to always be aware of that, because the special interest groups that I've been trying to indicate are trying to influence our government are also trying to influence our mass media, our mainstream knowledge. There's some things that they don't want you to know, to be quite honest. For example, they want you to think that you live in a democracy when it's actually an oligarchy. A democracy is for the people, of the people, by the people, and what we're having is government of the special interest groups, by the special interest group, for the special interest groups. Those rich and powerful companies are controlling our government. That's not a democracy. They want you to think that you're living in a capitalistic system, but it's really not. When you have 4 or 5 companies that control all the competition, they control the supply, they control the price, that's not free enterprise. That's not capitalism. I think we're going to see a movement either to make that completely controlled by a few companies, and corporations are going to run the world, so to speak, and there's movies and TV series of, with that kind of scenario. I hope that doesn't happen, because typically they're only worried about making money and the bottom line rules. It's a very dangerous kind of scenario. And in society, you're seeing the haves and the have-nots, and the haves are getting wealthier and the have-nots are getting poorer. There's just no other way to go around that. Some recent information this last week indicated that the middle class in the United States has fallen dramatically. That shouldn't surprise anybody. The wealthy, on the other hand, have increased their percentage of wealth as dramatically to their benefit. So you can see trends, you can see directions that things are going, and they're trying to mislead you on some of these very important kinds of issues. But they're also trying to mislead you on other kinds of issues, such as, are we the only intelligent life form in the universe? They want you to think we are. It fits into their narrative that goes along with evolution, and that we've come here and we're at the top of the peak. It's a form of exceptionalism, and that exceptionalism rides over into thinking Americans are exceptional, that we're special, that we have a God that's behind us and protecting us, and it's really a lot of baloney. It really is. This whole series of thinking is coming from people that want you to believe that, and they want you to believe that because it allows them to have profits in the military-industrial complex. It allows them to have profits in trade agreements. It allows them to have profits on international business arrangements. So there's all kinds of biases out there, and I would like to get into some of these issues, but I wanted you to understand first that you can't trust the mainstream. You can't trust what people are telling you about some of these issues. And you don't have to believe me, you come up to your own opinion on things, and my students do that very easily. But I needed to lay this groundwork today to allow us to get into some of these issues and look at them in more detail, because I think they're going to be critical issues on where the United States goes in the future, where our political and economic and social systems go in the future. And really, if you're talking about a Earth civilization, we have to be aware that the trends that we're in right now are not sustainable. Okay? Something's going to happen. It's not going to be good. We need to make some changes and change the trend to the future. I hope we can develop some more positive trends, and I have some solutions that I would like to share with you. So give me time. I'll try to package them in short sessions, but stay with me, and I appreciate your feedback. Okay? Have a good day.